I'm joined today by Roy Ngerng. Roy Ngerng is an NGO worker and activist. He was named a human rights defender by the United Nations for his activism in Singapore. Mr. Ngerng works as a program associate at a Taiwan-based NGO. Mr. Ngerng, thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
Now, Taiwan recently decided to raise its minimum wage at sort of kind of an annual meeting to decide the hike in that rate. They raised it to 168 new Taiwan dollars, or around $6 or a monthly wage of about 900 US dollars. Now, many cities in Taiwan have fairly high living costs, with some workers struggling to meet those costs on a minimum wage. Is Taiwan's latest rise in the minimum wage enough to help those people?
I'm actually quite glad you asked this question, because there is a misconception among many people living in Taiwan that because Taipei is the more expensive city and Kaohsiung and other parts of Taiwan have lower costs, therefore minimum wage should be lower in these places. But if you look at Numbeo, a website comparing the cost of living across different countries, you can see that Taiwan's grocery prices are actually one of the highest in the world. And if you look at housing, even though housing in the southern part of Taiwan is cheaper than in Taipei, but housing prices generally in Taiwan are one of the highest in the world. Also, when compared to wages, housing prices as compared to wages are also quite high. In Taipei, it's close to the level of Hong Kong, one of the worst in the world. So Taiwan's minimum wage as compared to living costs therefore are inadequate, whether is it in Taipei or in the southern part of Taiwan. Labor groups have said that they think that the minimum wage should be at the level of about $30,000, and that perhaps could be acceptable in the south, but in the north, it would need to be at least 40,000 or so. But even if you compare Taiwan with other advanced countries as a whole, pegged to the cost of living, Taiwan's minimum wage should actually be closer to $40,000 on average across the whole of Taiwan. So the fact that we are still seeing a minimum wage that is only about half to 60% of what is needed in terms of the minimum wage in Taiwan means that there are workers that are struggling and perhaps living in relative poverty.
I mean, you bring me on to my next point there, which is about how Taiwan stacks up when compared to other industrialized nations. I mean, what does Taiwan look like if you take that broader look at other countries as well?
If you look at Taiwan's minimum wage right now, across the whole of Taiwan, minimum wage is actually on par with Eastern European countries that have living costs that are only 20 to 30% lower than Taiwan, which means that Taiwan's minimum wage needs to be higher. And if pegged to the cost of living, it should be at about $40,000. And currently, their industry and service sector workers, there are about half of them who are earning $40,000. So just looking at the comparison with other countries and looking at how Taiwan's minimum wage would need to be at $40,000, it would therefore suggest that half of Taiwan's industry and service sector workers are possibly earning less than the minimum income required for a basic standard of living in Taiwan.
I've read your work, and you have lots of these very illustrative graphs that show how the Taiwan's wages have changed over time compared to various sort of indicators of economic growth, and you kind of repeatedly point to this kind of decoupling and kind of round about the beginning of Chen Shui-bian's presidency in around about the year 2001. What are the reasons for that? Why do we see this kind of this separation of, profits in some cases and kind of workers' compensation?
I think a main part of the reason would be the economic crisis in 1997. You can see that prior to 1997, Taiwan's minimum wage and GDP per capita was actually growing faster than even South Korea. And in fact, this is something that many people in Taiwan have forgotten, that Taiwan's minimum wage and GDP per capita used to be higher than South Korea. In fact, Taiwan's minimum wage was twice as high as South Korea in the early 1990s. But this has changed, turned around, and South Korea actually has twice the minimum wage as Taiwan right now. I think it's the different economic strategies that the governments in Taiwan and South Korea adopted. While South Korea felt that it had to turn into high-value manufacturing and economic development to grow its economy, Taiwan, however, decided that it would depress costs in order to allow profits to grow. And the opening up of China in the 2000s also resulted in businesses leaving Taiwan for China to take advantage of the lower costs. So if you look at indicators by the OECD, you can actually see that South Korea has still managed to maintain a relatively high originality in terms of their innovation and radicalness as measured by the OECD, while in Taiwan, we rank quite low in both of them. I think part of the reason for this, and research has suggested that paying people higher wages would tend to enhance the level of innovation, and Taiwan might have lost that level of innovation due to the sustained low wages that have been depressed. I think there is that tendency in Taiwan now to talk about how it is not possible for Taiwan to move into higher value production. I think this is a kind of a resignation that policymakers tend to take because they do not see how it is possible to move out from this innovation stagnation to a higher value stagnation. But what I think we might be missing here is that we are adopting a low-cost model, and if we do not jump out of this model, we will not be able to see how Taiwan would therefore have the potential to tap on the current expertise in Taiwan, tech expertise, the high level of education, to then move into higher value innovation. I mean, if you look at Taiwan's population and country size, it is actually very similar to the Netherlands, but the Netherlands has a GDP that per capita that is twice as high as Taiwan, and minimum wage actually about twice as high as Taiwan as well. So it is not that Taiwan doesn't have the capability, it is that Taiwan needs to transform, take a transformative perspective as to how it needs to grow. Some of the misconceptions that have been propagated is that if we increase minimum wage, unemployment will increase, and therefore we shouldn't spike up minimum wage. But if you look at unemployment in Taiwan, it has actually remained at a very stable level at about 3 to 4%. And in fact, if we were to nitpick, it is in the years where minimum wage growth was highest during Li Denghui and President Tsai Ing-wen's period, where unemployment rate were actually lower than the rest of the periods. Does this therefore mean that we should increase minimum wage to a higher level to reduce unemployment? So that is that causation, that lack of correlation that people are using to argue that minimum wage shouldn't be increased. I think on the other hand, if you look at the data, it might suggest that Taiwan actually has capacity in the economy to increase wages further, because if wages are increased to a higher level, there are people who are still willing to work, which suggests that if wages are higher, people are willing to come out to contribute further to the society. And this could perhaps be the mindset shift that we need to take. In terms of the economy and how the low-cost approach Taiwan has taken what it has caused, it has actually resulted in an excessive accumulation of profits. If you look at Taiwan in comparison with the European Union and South Korea, Taiwan's minimum wage growth and wages as a whole has actually lagged behind profits, while it has grown in tandem with profits in the European Union, for example. And this excessive rate of profits, if you look at the profit growth in together with housing prices, you can see that there is actually a similar pathway in terms of how housing prices are tracking the rate of profit growth as well, while minimum wage is falling behind that of both profit and housing prices, which means that the excessive profits are helping to result in an excessive speculation of housing, resulting in Taiwan's housing prices being one of the highest today, and one of the highest even when compared to wages. And it has created a huge pool of unproductive investments in housing. So how do we need to look at reversing this situation to prevent Taiwan from continuing in this lopsided economic pathway?
Mr. Ngerng, thank you for joining me.
Thank you.